Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Marla had heard the stories when she was a little girl, tucked in tight at night by her grandmother. It was a tale often whispered around the village, passed down by word of mouth, like so many other dark secrets that never made it into the history books. They said that deep in the woods, where the trees grew tall and thick, there was a well. No one knew who had built it or how long it had stood there, but it was said to be old, ancient, even and cursed. A well that granted wishes, but always at a terrible price. Marla never thought much of it. As a child, it was just another fairy tale, a cautionary tale to keep children close to home and out of trouble. But now, as a mother, those stories seemed less like fantasy and more like warnings. Her son, Tommy, had been sick for weeks. A fever that wouldn't break, a cough that rattled his small chest like an old clockwork toy, ticking louder and louder as the days went on. The doctors had no answers. They ran tests, they gave him medicines, but nothing helped. Each day, Tommy's face grew paler, his eyes more distant. She could see it in his gaze, a quiet resignation, as if he knew something she didn't. He wasn't getting better. Marla tried everything she could. She prayed, she cried, she begged. But when she sat by Tommy's bedside one night, holding his fragile hand, she felt a familiar, sickening thought creep into her mind. The thought of the well. Her grandmother's stories danced at the edge of her memory. The well of wishes, she'd said. A place where desperate souls go to make a wish. You might get what you want, but you'll lose something precious in return. The idea was ridiculous. Superstitions and old wives' tales, nothing more. But desperation made people do strange things. And so, in the dead of night, when the winds howled outside, Marla found herself standing at the edge of the forest, just like her grandmother once warned her not to. The air was thick with fog, a soft mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself, wrapping around her legs as she walked. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as if whispering secrets only the night could understand. Marla's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never ventured this far into the forest before. It was a place for children's stories, not for grown women with sick children. But here she was, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, she came upon the clearing. In the center was a stone well, half hidden by vines and overgrowth. It was as ancient as the stories said, the stones crumbling, the edges worn smooth by time. The air around it was heavy, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten wishes hung in the space between reality and something darker. The well seemed to hum, faintly like a living thing. Marla took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as they brushed the edge of the stone. She had heard the stories. She knew the risks. But Tommy was dying. Her hand trembled as she reached for the water. The well was silent now, the hum fading into the night air. She cupped her hands, drawing water from its depths, then whispered into the darkness. I wish for my son to be saved. Please, I'll do anything. Just save him. For a long moment, there was nothing. The night seemed to hold its breath, the trees still, the wind no longer stirring. Marla's heart raced in her chest. Had she done it wrong? Was it too late? Then, the well began to glow, a soft blue light rising from within. Marla stepped back, her heart pounding in her ears as the light grew brighter, warmer. It was as if the well was alive, breathing with the power of the earth itself. The air thickened, the trees creaking, as if they were bending under some unseen weight. And then a voice, a whisper, soft and ancient, rose from the well. You wish, and it shall be granted. It said, the voice deep and distant, like the rumble of thunder. But remember, all wishes come at a cost. Marla didn't know what that meant. She didn't care. Tommy's life was worth any price at all. "I accept," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Please, just save him." There was a sharp, unnatural stillness in the air. The mist seemed to thicken, swirling around her like a cold hand. Then the voice spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. "Your wish is granted." The glow from the well faded, and the forest fell silent once again. Marla stood there, shaking, unsure of what to do next. Had it worked? Was this some trick? But before she could process her thoughts, she turned and ran back to her house. She couldn't wait. She needed to see Tommy, to make sure he was all right. When she arrived at her doorstep, her heart caught in her throat. The door was slightly ajar. She had left it locked. She stepped inside, calling out for Tommy, but the house was eerily silent. Her pulse quickened, panic creeping up her spine. "Tommy," she whispered, stepping carefully into the hallway. The lights flickered above her, casting long shadows on the walls. She pushed open his bedroom door, her breath catching in her chest. There, in the bed, lay Tommy, sound asleep. He looked different somehow, healthier. His face had color, his breathing steady and calm. He looked like he was healing. She stepped closer, relief flooding her chest, but as she reached out to touch his forehead, a cold chill ran down her spine. The room was too still. Tommy's skin was warm, but his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anything at all. A soft, raspy whisper escaped from Tommy's lips, barely audible, as though the words weren't meant for anyone to hear. "It's too late." Marla froze, her blood running cold. "What do you mean, Tommy?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening?" Tommy didn't answer. His gaze never moved, never blinked. Marla backed away slowly, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. The wish, the well, what had she unleashed? She turned and ran to the door, but as she reached for the handle, she heard it. A low, guttural sound, coming from somewhere behind her. A scraping like nails against stone, followed by a soft, crooning laugh. It wasn't Tommy. It wasn't anyone she knew. Her blood froze. She turned, but the room was empty. Tommy was gone. Marla's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward, eyes scanning the room. The bed was empty, the covers twisted and askew as if someone, or something, had been there. But there was no sign of Tommy. Panic gripped her, making her breath come in short, frantic bursts. She whirled around, looking for any sign of movement, any trace of him. But the room remained still, silent, as if it were holding its breath. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the house like a death knell. Marla's body jerked with the force of it, and she spun to face it, her mind racing to comprehend what was happening. The walls, once warm and familiar, now seemed to press in on her, closing in with every breath she took. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air thick with an unnatural cold. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Her gaze darted to the window, but there was nothing outside, just the dark silhouette of the trees swaying in the wind. The forest seemed so far away now, but she knew that whatever she had done, it was tied to the well. The whispers, the glowing light, the promise. It was all tied to something darker, something that was now inside her home. She turned back to Tommy's bed, searching the shadows, hoping for some sign of him. Her legs felt weak beneath her, her knees threatening to buckle as she moved toward the bed once more. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Please, where are you?" The soft whispering laugh came again, but this time it was louder, closer, as if the very walls of the room were mocking her. A chill crawled up her spine, and her breath hitched. She turned around slowly, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. A figure materialized in the corner of the room, emerging from the shadows like a phantom. At first, Marla thought it was Tommy, but it wasn't. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, its face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, sharp teeth gleaming like daggers in the dim light. Did you think there would be no cost? The figure said, its voice a rasping whisper, as if it was not speaking to her directly, but through her very soul. You've made your wish, and now, I am here to collect. Marla's blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its form flickering in and out of focus, like it didn't belong in this world. She stumbled back, the weight of the situation crashing down on her all at once. The wish had not been a gift. It was a trap, and now she was caught in its snare. Who are you? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper as the figure loomed over her. I am the price, it hissed, its smile widening impossibly. I am the darkness that feeds on your guilt, your regret. I am the consequence of your choices. Marla's mind raced. What do you want from me? What have I done? The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes narrowing as it studied her. You sought to save your son, it said, the words laced with mocking amusement. And in doing so you condemned him. His life is not yours to take, not without cost. And now, you will bear the weight of that decision. The room seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in around her as if the house itself was alive and hungry. Marla's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something ancient and terrible. You have made your wish, the figure continued, its voice growing softer and more distant. Now, you must bear the consequences. The child you saved is not the child you remember. He is something else now, something that cannot be healed. And you will pay for your decision over and over again. The figure took a step forward, its form flickering again, and Marla's legs finally gave out beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to make this nightmare end, but the nightmare was real. It was happening. The figure loomed over her, its grin never fading, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that made her insides twist in terror. You cannot escape, it whispered, its voice now a cold breeze in her ear. You cannot undo what you have done. Marla's eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any way out, but there was nothing. The door was locked. The windows were barred. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every passing second. And then, through the haze of her panic, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere in the house. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Marla's head snapped toward the sound, her heart leaping in her chest. It was Tommy. She stood up with a cry, the world spinning around her as she ran toward the sound, toward the room at the end of the hall. Her pulse raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't care about the figure anymore. She didn't care about the darkness closing in around her. She had to find her son. She burst into the room at the end of the hall, her eyes scanning frantically. The room was empty, save for the rocking chair in the corner. The faint sound of the heartbeat was louder now, coming from the chair. It rocked gently back and forth, as though someone, or something, was sitting in it. Marla's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her eyes widening with horror. There, in the chair, was Tommy. But it wasn't Tommy. The child sitting in the chair had the same pale skin, the same thin frame, but his eyes were wide and empty. His mouth was slightly open, as if frozen in some twisted, silent scream. His body jerked spasmodically, as if something was pulling the strings from within. The heartbeat continued, steady and strong, but it wasn't Tommy's heartbeat. It was something else, something dark, something hungry. Marla took a step back, her legs shaking. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What happened to you? What's wrong?" The figure from the shadows appeared in the doorway, its grin widening as it watched her. "You wanted to save him," it whispered, "but you have only saved a shadow, a vessel for the darkness." Marla stumbled backward, her heart breaking. No, I didn't mean it. Please, I didn't mean it." The figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "You cannot undo your wish. You cannot undo the price you've paid. And now, he belongs to the well. The heartbeat continued to pound in her ears, steady and relentless, as Marla's world crumbled around her. The well had given her what she wanted, but it had taken more than she could have ever imagined. Marla's heart was a hollow drum in her chest, pounding with a force that threatened to shatter her ribs. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt paralyzed. Her legs were stiff, her feet glued to the floor as her eyes remained locked on Tommy, or what was left of him. The child in the chair twitched again, the unnatural jerks sharp and sudden, as if he were fighting against something far stronger than his frail body. His eyes locked onto her, hollow and empty, and for a moment, Marla could have sworn she saw something that wasn't Tommy peering back at her. Something dark, something ancient. Her breath hitched in her throat as she took a step closer, trembling. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. "Please, baby, come back to me. I'll fix this. I swear I'll fix this." The child's mouth opened slowly, but instead of speaking, a low, guttural growl escaped from his throat. It was the kind of sound no human could make. A noise that sent chills crawling across Marla's skin, like fingers brushing against her spine. The figure behind her spoke again, its voice like the scrape of nails on stone. "He cannot return, not as he was. Not after what you have done." Marla spun around, her eyes wild with panic. The figure's grin was wider now, more twisted, as if savoring her suffering. She could feel the coldness of its presence, like a shadow creeping through her veins, suffocating her. "What is this? What have I done?" she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Her hands shook as she reached out for the figure, her voice breaking. "I only wanted to save him. I didn't know. I didn't know." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its body flickering like a flame in the wind. The coldness intensified as it neared her, seeping into her bones, and she gasped for breath, as if the very air had become thick with malice. "You wished for him to be saved," the figure said, its voice soft, almost pitying. "But you did not understand the price. The wish is never truly granted. It is only borrowed, and it must always be repaid." Marla's head spun, the world around her bending and warping, as if she were standing on the edge of some deep, endless chasm. She felt as though the ground beneath her might give way at any moment, sending her into the abyss with no hope of return. Her eyes flickered back to Tommy, and she realized, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The well had given her a false hope, a cruel illusion. The child's body jerked again, his fingers twitching in the air, but this time, his movements were slower, more deliberate. He was no longer the boy she had known, the boy who had smiled, laughed, and played. No, this was something else, something far worse. A deep, rasping voice echoed in her mind, louder than any whisper. "You've unleashed it." Marla's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to flee from the nightmare she had brought upon herself and her son, but she was trapped. Trapped in this house, in this dark, suffocating room with the thing she had called into existence. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. What could she do? Was there a way to undo it? Could she make another wish? Would that save Tommy? But deep down, she knew. There was no escaping the well's curse. There was no way out of the trap she had fallen into. The figure, still watching her with that awful, cruel smile, took another step forward. "It feeds on your guilt," it said softly. "The more you regret your wish, the stronger it becomes. It feeds on your suffering, your sorrow, and it will never be satisfied." Marla's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her face, sobbing uncontrollably. What had she done? "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please take it back. I'll give anything. Just bring my son back." But the figure only chuckled, the sound hollow and dark, like something far beyond the reach of mercy. "There is no taking it back. Not now. Not after the well has claimed its price." She looked back at Tommy, if that was even still him, and saw the flicker of movement in his eyes. The child twisted in the chair, his body moving in strange, unnatural ways. His mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, and from within him came a sound like breaking glass, like the shattering of something fragile and precious. Marla screamed, her hands covering her ears, but the sound continued, growing louder, more distorted. Her head throbbed with the intensity of it, and she felt as if her mind might crack from the pressure. Then a new voice, different from the figures, began to echo in the room, a voice Marla knew all too well. It was Tommy's voice, or at least it had been. But now it was twisted, warped by something dark and unholy. "Mama," the voice croaked, weak and raspy. "Mama, help me." Marla's heart shattered. The voice sounded so much like her son, but there was something wrong about it, something that made her blood run cold. Her eyes flew to Tommy, or the thing that had once been Tommy, and she saw the creature slowly rise from the chair, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. She backed away, panic surging through her veins. The creature, Tommy, reached out a hand, its fingers twitching like the legs of an insect, its mouth still open wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Mama," it whispered again, but this time the voice wasn't just Tommy's. It was something else, something darker, something that wanted to pull her into the abyss with it. Marla stood frozen, her mind screaming, but her body incapable of moving. She knew she had to run. She had to escape. But how could she leave him behind? How could she leave her son to whatever this was? The figure moved toward her again, its presence oppressive and suffocating. "You wanted him to live," it murmured, its eyes glowing faintly. "Now you must live with the consequences. The well never gives without taking, and what it takes is everything." Marla took a trembling step backward, her mind racing for a way out, but there was no escape. The well had claimed her son. The well had claimed her soul. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and she was alone with the creature, alone with the thing that had once been her child. And then, the shadows began to close in, consuming the room, swallowing everything in its wake. The shadows thickened, swirling around her like a storm. The darkness seemed alive, wrapping around Marla's limbs, pulling at her, dragging her deeper into the suffocating void. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and she could feel it pressing in on her, stifling her every breath. Her heart raced, the pulse in her ears deafening as her vision blurred. Every inch of the room felt as though it were closing in on her, every corner a trap she couldn't escape. Tommy, if that was even him, was still there, looming in the corner, his distorted form flickering in and out of focus like a shadow caught in the wind. The thing that had once been her child took slow, deliberate steps toward her, its head tilting at an odd, unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide, black voids, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't belong on a human face. "Mama," the voice whispered again, softer this time, but still unmistakably Tommy's, like the faintest echo of a memory she could never forget. "Mama, help me." Marla's throat tightened, the lump of guilt and terror lodged there making it hard to breathe. She couldn't look at him. This wasn't her son. This was something else, something monstrous that had taken his place. She had wished for his life to be saved, but the price had been too great, and now there was no turning back. No way to fix what she had broken. The thing's body twisted again, contorting unnaturally, the limbs bending at odd angles, as if they weren't made for this world. Its hands reached out toward her, fingers curling like claws, the coldness of its touch already seeping through the air. Marla backed up, her heels hitting the floor with a dull thud as she tried to put distance between herself and the creature. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, pressing in from all sides. The door, her only means of escape, was still firmly shut, as if the house itself were preventing her from leaving. A low, guttural growl rumbled in the back of Tommy's throat, and Marla's stomach churned. She had to escape. She couldn't be here anymore. "Please, please stop," she cried, her voice breaking. "Please, Tommy, I don't know what to do. I didn't mean it. Please come back to me." The creature's grin only widened, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. It didn't respond with words this time. Instead, it took another step forward, its movements deliberate and slow, as if savoring the fear that radiated from Marla. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and she could see her breath in front of her, a mist of white swirling in the freezing air. Her chest tightened with an overwhelming sense of dread. She was trapped in her own home with the thing she had unknowingly unleashed. The well had granted her wish, but it had taken her son and replaced him with a nightmare that would haunt her until the end of her days. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against her arm, and the coldness that radiated from it sent a shockwave of terror through her. She gasped, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. The thing that had been her child was now holding her, its grip unyielding, its fingers digging into her skin like ice. Marla struggled, panic surging through her, but the harder she fought, the tighter its hold became. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice low and full of malice. "You belong to the well now, just like him. You will suffer, just like he will." The coldness spread from the point of contact, spreading through her veins, seeping into her bones. Marla's vision blurred, her mind slipping into a haze. She could feel her strength draining, her body weakening with each passing second. The creature's grip was like iron, its presence suffocating, draining the very life out of her. "Mama, help me!" The voice echoed again, but this time, it wasn't just Tommy's voice. It was the voices of others, countless others, their cries of desperation blending with his. Marla's mind spun as the darkness began to consume her. The cold, the voices, the thing she had once called her son, all of it twisted together, pulling her down into an abyss of guilt and terror. She had been foolish, desperate. The well had never been a gift. It was a curse that fed on sorrow, on regret, and now she was bound to it, just as her son was. Her head spun, dizziness overtaking her as her body grew weaker. She could feel the weight of the guilt crushing her, each breath heavier than the last. The well had taken everything, and it would take more before it was done with her. Her vision began to fade, the edges of the room growing darker, and the sounds of Tommy's tortured whispers blending with the oppressive silence that filled the space. The thing that had been her child was still there, its grin still stretched impossibly wide, its hollow eyes burning into her very soul. And then, as if the darkness itself had swallowed her, everything went black. Marla awoke with a jolt, her breath coming in gasps. She sat up quickly, heart hammering in her chest, her hands trembling as they pressed to the cold floor beneath her. Her eyes darted around the room, and she was momentarily disoriented, unsure of where she was. But then she remembered. The house. The well. Tommy. A low, rattling breath escaped her lips as she looked around. The room was empty. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed distant, as if the house itself had grown somehow smaller, more oppressive in its stillness. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but she forced herself to move. The door was open. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, casting long shadows on the floor. But there was no sound, no movement. She stumbled into the hallway, her mind still fogged with fear and confusion. She looked around, searching for any sign of Tommy. But there was nothing. No. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Her eyes fixed on the stairs ahead, the dark staircase leading down to the basement. The place where it all began, where she had made her wish. Where the well waited. She didn't know why she felt compelled to go there, to return to the very source of her torment. But she did. She couldn't stop herself. As she descended the stairs, each step echoing in the silence, she could feel something. A presence, something that had been there all along, watching, waiting. The coldness she had felt before was returning, creeping back into the very air, settling in her bones. At the bottom of the stairs, she hesitated. The door to the basement stood before her, dark and foreboding. But she could hear it now, faintly at first, but growing louder. A whisper. No. A plea. Marla's breath caught in her throat as she stepped toward the door, her hand trembling as it reached for the handle. "Mama," the voice whispered again, softer this time, almost drowned in the growing darkness. "Please." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come, and opened the door. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges protesting with a low, groaning sound that echoed through the otherwise silent house. A gust of cold air rushed up from the depths of the basement, sending a chill straight through Marla's bones. The darkness below seemed to pulse with life, as if the very air was alive with anticipation. The voice, still faint, continued to call her name. "Mama!" It was Tommy's voice again, distant but clear. Her heart skipped a beat. The familiar plea twisted in her chest, a mixture of hope and terror. Was this truly her son? Was it Tommy, calling to her from the depths of the well's curse? Or was it something darker, something more insidious, using her child's voice to manipulate her? Marla stepped down the stairs, her footfalls soft and hesitant, as if the very ground beneath her was unstable, ready to collapse at any moment. The air grew thicker as she descended, the scent of damp earth and decay filling her nose. Her fingers trembled on the railing, each step downward making the dread in her chest grow heavier, until it felt like a physical weight. The basement was colder than she had ever remembered, colder than it had ever been before. The walls were damp, water trickling down in small rivulets, and the floor was slick with the same dark, sticky substance that had first filled the well when she had made her wish. Her eyes scanned the space, but the shadows seemed to shift, as if the basement was refusing to reveal its full horrors to her. As she reached the bottom, she saw it. The well. Its stone walls loomed before her, ancient and weathered, its gaping mouth waiting for her. The air around it was heavy, thick with an oppressive presence, as though the well itself was watching her, waiting for her to fall into its trap once again. "Mama, help me!" The voice called again, louder now, and this time there was a desperate edge to it. It sounded like her son, no longer twisted by whatever force had claimed him, but just Tommy. The voice seemed to echo off the stone walls, bouncing around her head, pulling her closer to the well, to the darkness that lay within. Marla's feet moved of their own accord, a magnet pulling her forward, her body unsteady but determined. She didn't want to look into the well again, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to see if Tommy was really there, if he was really calling to her. She knelt by the well, her fingers brushing against the rough stone as she peered down into the abyss below. The darkness swallowed everything, deeper than any well she had ever known, an endless pit of nothingness. And yet there it was, a faint glimmer of light. It flickered like a candle flame, soft and distant, but it was there. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice breaking as she called out, her throat tight with fear. "Tommy, if that's you, please answer me." For a long moment, there was nothing. The well was silent, its depths as dark and cold as ever. And then, just as she thought she had imagined it all, the light flickered again, and she saw something, a shape moving in the depths. Her heart stopped. She leaned forward, eyes straining, and then he appeared. It was Tommy, or rather, it looked like Tommy, the boy she had once known, his small face framed by the darkness, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Mama," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Please help me." Marla's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she believed that this was real, that her son was down there, that she could save him. But then, as if to shatter the illusion, Tommy's face twisted. His features blurred, rippling like a reflection on the surface of water. His eyes blackened, his skin grew pale and cracked, his body elongating in strange, unnatural ways. He was still speaking, but the words became distorted, overlapping with other voices, hundreds, maybe thousands, crying out in agony. "Mama, help me!" The voice croaked, but it wasn't just Tommy's voice anymore. It was a chorus of wails, of pleading voices, all begging for release, all reaching up from the well, pulling her in. Marla stumbled back, her heart racing in her chest. Her hands trembled as she scrambled away from the edge, her mind a blur of terror. She could hear it now, the faint but undeniable sound of movement beneath the ground. Something was down there. Something had been waiting for her all along. The walls of the basement seemed to groan in protest, and the floor beneath her feet began to tremble. A deep, guttural sound rose from the depths of the well, like the roar of a beast awakening from slumber. "No," Marla whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This can't be real. This isn't him. It can't be him." But even as she said it, she felt the pull. The well was alive, alive with the hunger that had fed on her sorrow and her guilt. The creature inside was calling to her, to finish what had been started, to pay the price for her foolish wish. The ground beneath her feet shook again, this time violently, and the air grew thick with the stench of rot and decay. She could hear the sound of something crawling, dragging itself up from the depths of the well. A low, wet sound, like the slithering of a creature made of darkness. "No!" Marla cried out, scrambling to her feet. "Stay away from me!" But it was too late. The thing had reached the edge of the well, and Marla froze, her blood running cold as it rose from the darkness. It was Tommy? No, it wasn't. The figure that emerged was twisted, misshapen, and far too large to be a child. It was an amalgamation of faces and limbs, a grotesque patchwork of human features, some of them familiar, others unfamiliar, and all of them wrong. It wore Tommy's face, but it was distorted, the eyes too wide, the mouth too long. It was a thing of nightmares, a mockery of the child she had once known, and it was coming for her. Marla screamed and stumbled backward, but the thing was already reaching for her. Its cold, clammy fingers brushed against her ankle, and the icy shock of its touch sent a jolt of terror through her, freezing her in place. She tried to kick it away, but its grip tightened, pulling her toward the edge of the well. "Please, please, no!" Marla cried out, her voice desperate, but the thing only grinned wider, its mouth stretching impossibly large. It was no longer Tommy. It was something else, something that had been born from her guilt, from her desperation, and from the curse of the well. "Mama!" it whispered, its voice now a guttural rasp, full of hunger and malice. "Mama, come to me." Marla's mind screamed in terror, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to end this. She had to end the curse before it consumed her, before it took everything else she had ever loved. With a strength she didn't know she had, she kicked out, her foot connecting with the creature's chest. It recoiled, its form shifting and warping, but the grip on her ankle didn't loosen. "Let me go!" she shouted, her hands reaching for the well's edge, clawing at the stone, desperate to pull herself away. But the thing was stronger. It dragged her closer to the well's dark mouth, and she could feel its cold breath on her skin, its fingers digging into her, pulling her toward the abyss. Marla closed her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest, and made one final decision. She would make one last wish. Marla's fingers dug into the stone at the edge of the well, the rough surface scraping her skin as she clung to it with all her might. Her body felt weak, her strength waning, but her desperation gave her the strength to keep fighting. The creature was pulling her closer, its grip like ice, dragging her toward the dark abyss below. She could feel the cold breath of the well, the stench of decay, and the suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. A thought flickered through her mind, the thought that had driven her to this point, the thought that had made her wish in the first place. Her son, Tommy. She had tried to save him. She had thought she could make everything right with a wish. But now, as she felt the weight of her guilt and the full scope of the curse, she realized the truth. There was no escape from the well's grip. She had already made her choice. She had already condemned herself. But then, something else inside her stirred. A flicker of hope, of defiance, burning through the overwhelming guilt. She could still fight. She could still make one final attempt. One last wish. Marla's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The thing's face, if it could even be called a face, loomed over her, twisted and contorted into a grotesque mask of hunger. Its eyes, black and empty, bore into her, mocking her, feeding on her fear. "Please," she gasped, barely able to speak. "Please, Tommy. Please, I'll do anything. I just want you back. I want everything to be like it was before." For a moment, there was silence. The creature stopped pulling her, its grip loosening slightly. It tilted its head, as though considering her words. The light from the well flickered, and Marla felt the weight of her choice pressing down on her chest. She could feel the ancient power of the well thrumming beneath her feet, waiting to claim her soul. It had taken so much from her already. Her son, her peace, her life. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. Not completely. Not without a fight. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the small, faded photograph of Tommy. The photograph she had carried with her every day since his birth. Her eyes blurred with tears as she held it tightly, the paper crinkling in her grasp. She whispered, almost as if speaking to the photo itself. I wish for my son to come back. I wish for him to be safe. I'll give anything. Please, just let him come back." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Marla waited, her heart pounding, her eyes squeezed shut, praying for something, anything, to change. And then, the ground beneath her shook. A low rumbling, like thunder from deep within the earth, vibrated through her body. She gasped, her fingers digging into the stone, as the well trembled, the air growing heavier and more oppressive. The thing that had once been her son let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as it reached for her once again. "No," Marla whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, this isn't what I meant. I didn't wish for this." But it was too late. The well had answered her wish. It had twisted her words, as it always did. It had granted her what she had asked for, but at a price. A terrible, horrible price. Suddenly she felt it, a sharp, stabbing pain in her chest, as though something had pierced her heart. A cold, dark force rushed through her veins, spreading from her core outward, filling her entire being with ice. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something more agonizing. The creature, the twisted, dark thing, pulled back from her as the pain consumed her. It hissed, its face contorting into a terrible snarl as it watched her, its mouth opening wide, as though it could taste her suffering. Marla's vision blurred. Her limbs began to numb, her strength draining away as she collapsed to the floor. She tried to scream, to fight back, but her body refused to respond. The darkness was closing in, and she felt herself slipping, fading, being pulled into an endless void. And then there was a sound. It wasn't the thing's voice anymore, or the wails of the lost souls from the depths of the well. It was a voice she knew well, a soft, innocent voice that had once called her name with such sweetness. "Mama!" Her heart froze in her chest, and her eyes snapped open. There, standing in front of her, was Tommy. Real Tommy. The little boy she had loved, the boy she had fought so hard to save. He was alive. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Tommy, is it really you?" Tommy smiled, his eyes sparkling with innocence, as though nothing had ever happened, as though everything was just as it should be. He reached out his hand to hers, and she felt the warmth of his touch as their fingers brushed. But then, as her hand closed around his, something shifted. Tommy's smile faltered, his eyes darkening. His face began to change, flickering, as if the image of him was no longer real. His form rippled, contorting, and Marla felt her stomach twist in horror as his body morphed, turning into something else entirely. "No," she whispered, backing away, her hands raised in disbelief. "No, no, no." The figure in front of her began to shrivel and warp, the skin stretching, the features twisting, until all that was left was a grotesque, snarling thing with eyes that burned with malice. It was no longer Tommy. It was a creature made of her guilt, her despair. It was the well's true face, and it had come to claim her once and for all. Marla's heart pounded in her chest as the creature lunged at her, its claws reaching for her throat, its voice hissing in her ear. "You wished for him back, didn't you? But you didn't say how he'd come back. You didn't think it through, did you?" Marla screamed, but it was too late. The darkness enveloped her, the coldness suffocating her, dragging her down into the abyss. She had made her final wish, and the well had claimed her soul. Marla's vision blurred, the edges of her world fading into a thick, swirling darkness. The last thing she felt was the creature's cold claws tightening around her throat, choking off her scream as it dragged her deeper into the abyss. The well's hunger was insatiable, and now it had claimed her, body and soul. But even as the darkness swallowed her, something strange began to happen. The air around her seemed to shift, the oppressive weight of the well lifting just slightly, as if the curse itself was momentarily sated. For a fleeting moment, Marla felt the tiniest spark of hope. The creature's grip loosened, just enough to allow her to breathe again. And then suddenly there was a voice that was not the creature's, but one that she knew all too well. It was Tommy's voice, clear, pure, not twisted by the well's darkness. It called to her from somewhere far away. "Mama, please come back." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was real. It was her son. She could hear the softness, the innocence in it, and it was like a lifeline thrown to her in the darkest of waters. "Tommy," Marla gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Tommy, where are you? Please come to me." The darkness around her seemed to recoil, and for a moment, Marla thought she saw something, someone in the shadows. A figure, faint but unmistakable. A small figure, standing in the distance, bathed in a soft, golden light. Tommy. Real Tommy. She reached for him, her body moving on its own, desperate, her hands trembling as she stretched them toward him. But as she moved closer, the figure began to fade. It flickered like a candle flame in the wind, its edges blurring and distorting. Marla's breath caught in her throat as the image wavered, shifting in and out of focus, just out of reach. She felt a terrible pull, like gravity itself was trying to drag her back into the darkness. "No! Tommy, wait! Don't leave me!" Her voice was hoarse, filled with panic, but the figure of Tommy continued to retreat. The light grew dimmer, fading into the ever-present blackness that had claimed the well, as if it was being swallowed up by the very curse she had unleashed. Marla stumbled forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to reach him. She had to bring him back. But each step she took seemed to bring her no closer. The light from Tommy's figure grew dimmer, and the sounds of his voice began to warp, fading into something darker. "Mama, help me!" The voice called again, but now it sounded hollow, empty. It was no longer the voice of her son. It was the same twisted, mocking voice that had come from the well. Her legs gave way beneath her, and Marla collapsed to the ground. She screamed, but no sound came out, as if the very air had thickened to the point where she couldn't even make a sound. The creature was back. Its form rose from the depths of the well, a shadowy mass of shifting limbs and faces, each one contorted in agony. It reached for her, its claws scraping against the stone of the well, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "No!" Marla cried, scrambling backward, but the creature was too quick. It was upon her in an instant, its cold hands grasping at her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She fought with everything she had left, clawing at the floor, her hands slipping against the slick surface, her fingers trembling with fear and exhaustion. But the creature was relentless. Its weight was suffocating, and its breath, if it could even be called breath, was foul, a stench of rot and decay that filled her lungs and made her dizzy. "Please no," Marla whispered, the tears streaming down her face as she struggled against the creature's grip. "I just wanted my son back. I never meant for this. I never meant for any of this." The creature's laugh was low, guttural, and filled with malice. It leaned closer, its face flickering in and out of focus, its eyes full of hunger. "You can never undo the wishes of the well," it hissed. "Once you make a wish, there is no going back. Your son is mine now, and so are you." Marla's heart shattered as she realized the truth. She had sealed her fate when she first made her wish. The well had taken what it wanted, and no matter how much she struggled, no matter how much she begged, she would never escape it. The cost of her wish had been too great, and there was no way to undo it. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a small, defiant spark still flickered within her. A thought, a single fleeting thought. What if there was another way? Her mind raced, the pain and terror clouding her thoughts, but something still remained. She thought of Tommy again, of his face, his laughter, the joy he had brought to her life. And in that moment, she realized something else. The well didn't just take. It didn't just consume. It twisted everything, warped reality. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make things right. With everything she had left, Marla gathered her strength. She took a deep, shaky breath and whispered the words that she had feared to speak, the words she had avoided for so long. I wish for it all to end, for this curse to be broken, for my son to be free." The well's grip tightened around her, and the creature's laughter rose to a deafening pitch, but Marla didn't flinch. She focused on the words, on the wish that she was making. This time, it wasn't about saving Tommy. This time, it was about freeing him and herself from the curse that had taken everything from them. And then, as the darkness closed in once more, something changed. The well itself seemed to shudder, as though it were waking from a long slumber. The grip of the creature loosened, its form flickering and shifting, as though it were being torn apart by an unseen force. Marla felt herself falling, plummeting into the abyss, but she didn't scream. She didn't fight. She embraced it. And then, the world went silent. When Marla opened her eyes again, she wasn't sure how much time had passed. The coldness that had once consumed her body was gone, replaced by a strange sense of weightlessness, as if she were floating. She couldn't feel the well's grip, nor the presence of the creature. For the first time since her wish, she felt free. Her breath was slow and steady, her chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm, as though the weight of the curse had finally lifted. She opened her eyes fully, blinking against the dim light around her. It wasn't the darkness of the well she had come to know. No, this was different. The air was clearer, fresher, as if she had somehow crossed into another realm. There was a faint glow in the distance, like the first rays of dawn breaking over a shadowed landscape. Slowly, carefully, Marla stood. Her legs felt solid beneath her, her body steady, though her heart raced in anticipation. She looked around, trying to make sense of where she was. The ground beneath her feet was soft, covered in grass, the sky overhead a pale, calm blue. But there was no mistaking the fact that something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. This place, whatever it was not the world she knew. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, a figure appeared in the distance. A small figure, walking toward her through the grass. Marla's heart skipped in her chest, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the face. It was Tommy, her Tommy, alive, just as he had been before the illness. His eyes were wide, full of innocence, and his smile was the same as it had been when he was younger. The way he used to smile at her, so full of love and trust. "Mama," Tommy said, his voice soft like a gentle breeze. Marla stumbled toward him, her hands outstretched, her eyes filled with tears. "Tommy, is it really you? Are you okay?" Tommy nodded, his face glowing with the pure joy of being alive, of being whole. "I'm fine, Mama. I'm not sick anymore. You fixed everything." Her heart broke as she reached out to touch his face, feeling the warmth of his skin. "Oh, baby, I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix it." But Tommy only smiled, a smile that filled her heart with hope. "You did, Mama. You made everything right. You brought me back." Marla's heart lifted at his words, but something deep inside her nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. As much as she wanted to believe that everything was truly right again, there was a lingering doubt. She had made a wish. She had tried to cheat fate, and wishes made at the well never came without a price. There had to be more to this than met the eye. Tommy reached out and took her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers with the same tenderness she had always known. "Mama, come with me," he said, his voice sweet, but there was an edge to it now, a subtle shift that sent a cold chill down Marla's spine. "There's something I want to show you." For a moment, Marla hesitated. The air around her had grown colder, the warmth she had felt from Tommy's presence beginning to fade. She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of the boy she had known. But there was something unfamiliar in those eyes now, a darkness that she couldn't quite place. Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tommy's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just trust me, Mama. It's going to be okay." Marla tried to shake off the unease that was creeping into her chest, trying to convince herself that it was just the lingering effects of the curse. But as Tommy tugged her forward, she couldn't help the sinking feeling in her gut. They walked for what seemed like hours, the landscape stretching out before them, an endless, grassy field that seemed to go on forever. The soft hum of the wind in the trees was the only sound, and with each step, Marla's sense of dread deepened. She glanced at Tommy, who walked ahead of her, his back straight, his movements fluid and carefree. But every so often, his head would tilt just slightly, as if listening to something distant, something only he could hear. Finally, they reached a clearing, and in the center of it stood a large, stone structure. It looked familiar. In fact, it looked exactly like the well. But this time, there was no mistaking it for a place of hope. This was the well, but it had been transformed, twisted. The stone was blackened, cracked, and oozing with a dark substance that seemed to writhe like liquid shadows. Marla's heart raced as she took a step back, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was it, the well, the very source of the curse. But it wasn't a well of wishes anymore. It was a prison, a trap, and Tommy had led her here. "Tommy, what is this? What are you showing me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tommy turned to her, his face now completely devoid of the innocence she had seen earlier. His eyes were hollow, black pits, and his smile twisted into something that resembled a sneer. "You think you're free, don't you? You think your wish was granted. But you didn't understand. You never understood." Marla's chest tightened as the realization hit her like a wave. This wasn't Tommy. It wasn't her son. It was the curse of the well, manifesting once more, using Tommy's form to lure her into the final trap. "You," she whispered, backing away. "You're not him. You're not my son." The creature, whatever it was, laughed, a sound that reverberated in the air like 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. "No, Marla, I am what you've made me, and now you're mine." Tommy's form shimmered, shifting in and out of focus, until it was no longer the boy she had known. It was a mass of shifting shadows, a writhing entity that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. It was the well's true power, the dark force that had taken everything from her. The wish she had made had bound them together, Tommy's life and her own soul, forever entwined in the well's curse. With a final scream of terror, Marla fell to her knees, her mind breaking as the full weight of the curse consumed her. There was no escape now, no way out. The well had claimed her, and it would never let her go. Marla's body trembled violently, her mind spiraling into a vortex of despair as the dark entity loomed over her. It seemed to grow larger, its shadow stretching across the landscape, swallowing the faint light that had once illuminated her path. The hollow, mocking laugh echoed in her ears, and for a moment she wondered if it was all truly real. If she was caught in some nightmare, trapped in a waking hell. But deep down she knew the truth. The well wasn't just a source of dark magic, it was alive. A malevolent, insatiable force that fed on despair, regret, and the wishes of the desperate. She had wished for Tommy's life, but what she hadn't realized was that the well never gave without taking something in return. And now the price had come due. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of her guilt. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with the energy of the well, an unnatural force that made her feel as though she were sinking into it, her feet glued to the soil, as though she were being absorbed by the earth itself. Her heart hammered in her chest as she looked up at the dark shape that had once been her son, now an abyss of shadow and malice. The creature tilted its head, its empty eyes narrowing in amusement as it watched her struggle. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you, Marla?" It hissed, its voice laced with venom. "You thought you could wish it all away. But nothing is ever as simple as you imagine." Marla's breath hitched. She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat constricted, as though the very curse of the well had tightened its grip on her, choking her, silencing her. All she could do was sit there, frozen in the face of her own choices, as the entity grew closer, its form shifting like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. It extended a clawed hand toward her, its fingers long and twisted, gleaming with an otherworldly glow. Marla's instinct screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if the weight of her decision had rendered her immobile, powerless to escape the consequences. "Why did you do it, Marla?" The voice echoed around her, not just in her ears, but in her very mind. "Why did you make a wish at all? Didn't you know what the price would be?" Her eyes blurred with tears as the creature's words cut through her like a knife. She hadn't thought it through. She hadn't understood the curse. She had been desperate to save her son, willing to do anything, just to see him smile again. But now, it was clear that her wish had opened the door to something far worse. The well wasn't just a source of magic, it was a sentient thing, and its hunger for souls had no end. Her vision swam, and she felt herself falling, her body collapsing onto the ground. She reached out in vain, trying to touch the grass beneath her, to grasp onto something solid, but everything around her was slipping away. And then, just as she thought it was all over, a small, flickering light appeared in the distance. At first, she thought it was a trick of her mind, a figment of her fading consciousness. But as she focused, she saw it clearly, a single golden light shining through the darkness. It was faint, but it was there. A beacon. Marla's heart skipped a beat as the light grew brighter, clearer. She strained to sit up, her body screaming in protest, her limbs weak, but the light was calling to her. It wasn't the well. It wasn't the creature. It was something else, something pure, something that felt familiar. "Tommy," she whispered, though she knew in her heart it wasn't him. The light grew brighter, forming a figure, human, though blurred and shifting, like a reflection on water. Marla's breath caught as the shape became clearer, solidifying into a form she knew all too well. Her own mother. It was impossible. Her mother had passed away years ago, long before Tommy's illness. But here she was, standing before her, her face soft and kind, a reassuring smile on her lips. The glow surrounding her was gentle, warm, everything that the creature was not. "Mom," Marla whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Is it really you?" Her mother nodded, her eyes full of understanding and sorrow. "It's me, Marla," she said softly. "I'm here to help you." Marla's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't understand. The well had taken so much from her already, hadn't it? Why would her mother be here now? Her mother's expression softened, and she knelt beside her daughter, placing a hand on Marla's trembling shoulder. "The well feeds on guilt and regret, Marla. It thrives on the things we can't let go of. the wishes we make in desperation. But there's always a way out, my love. You just have to face the truth. Marla's mind reeled. The truth, she whispered. But I made the wish for Tommy. I tried to save him, but it was my fault. It's all my fault. Her mother's voice was calm, soothing. You acted out of love, Marla. Don't let the well convince you otherwise. The price you paid, the price we all pay for the things we do out of love, is heavy. But it's not the end. Not if you can forgive yourself. Marla shook her head, tears blurring her vision. How can I forgive myself? I killed him. I let him die. I brought this curse down upon us, and now everything is destroyed. Her mother's voice was gentle but firm. You can't change the past, my dear. You can't undo what's been done. But you can release it. You can let go of the guilt, of the fear. The well thrives on those emotions. Without them, it loses its power. Marla's chest tightened with the weight of the words, but deep down, she knew her mother was right. She had been consumed by guilt. She had thought that by wishing for Tommy's life, she could undo the tragedy. But in doing so, she had only bound herself deeper into the well's curse. Let it go, her mother urged, her voice a gentle whisper in the air. Release it, and the well will lose its hold over you. Marla closed her eyes, her heart aching with the depth of her grief. She thought of Tommy, of his smile, of the life she had tried to save. She thought of the moments they had shared, of all the joy that had once been in her life. But in that moment, she realized something. She had to release the pain. The well had fed off her regret, her guilt. But if she could let it go, she could break the curse. Her breath slowed as she took a deep, shaky breath. With each exhale, she felt the weight of the guilt lift slightly, the dark energy around her beginning to fade. The shadowy figure of the creature seemed to waver, its form shifting as though it, too, could feel the change. The well's power was weakening, unraveling. And then, with a final, forceful breath, Marla released it. She released her guilt, her fear, her need to control what was already lost. The creature's form began to unravel, its shadow fading into the air. The well trembled, its power waning as Marla's soul found peace, as she accepted the truth. Sometimes, love was about letting go, even when it hurt. The darkness faded, and with it, the well's grip. The world around Marla began to shift as the oppressive darkness receded, and she felt the weight lift from her chest. The air was no longer thick with despair. Instead, it was crisp, clean, and filled with a quiet peace. The figure of her mother, still glowing with a soft, golden light, smiled warmly at her. Good, her mother whispered, her voice tender. You've done it, Marla. You've freed yourself. Marla took a trembling breath, her mind clearing with every second. She looked around, her heart filled with a sense of finality. The landscape that had once felt like a twisted nightmare now seemed to return to something more familiar. The air was lighter, and the oppressive feeling of the well's curse had vanished. She turned her gaze back to her mother. I don't understand, Marla whispered, her voice still shaky. I thought I had to fix it. I thought I could change everything. But I see now it wasn't about fixing things. It was about accepting what I couldn't control. Her mother nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. Exactly. Love can't undo the past, Marla. But it can help you move forward, free of the chains that hold you back. Marla's heart was still heavy with the weight of her actions, the memories of Tommy's illness, of the moments she could never get back. But as her mother's words sank in, she realized that the road to healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it, letting it go, and finding peace. The light around her mother began to dim slightly, signaling that it was time for her to go. It's time, my dear, she said, her voice still gentle. The curse is broken. You're free now. Marla's chest tightened, but she knew it was true. Her mother's presence had given her the strength to face the truth, to release the guilt that had held her captive for so long. And now, it was time for her to let go once more, to say goodbye. With tears in her eyes, Marla nodded. Thank you, she whispered. I love you. Her mother smiled, a sad yet knowing smile. "I love you too, Marla. Always." And then, as gently as a breeze, her mother's form faded into the light, leaving Marla standing alone in the peaceful clearing. For a long moment, Marla stood there, absorbing the silence, the emptiness, and yet the quiet peace that filled her heart. The darkness was gone, and with it, the burden she had carried for so long. But something shifted within her. The landscape before her, though calm, was still a place of liminality, as though she stood between two worlds. The well was still there in the distance, but it no longer held the same power. It was now a quiet relic of the past, its dark energy dissipating. The whispers were gone, the pull, the hunger. All that was left was the soft, fading echo of what had been. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Marla felt a sense of hope rising inside her. She could breathe again. She could live again. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling as she grasped the grass beneath her, steadying herself. The ground felt solid under her touch, as though she was once again grounded in the reality she had nearly lost. The weight of the well had lifted from her shoulders, and though the memories of her son's death would always remain, they no longer felt like a chain dragging her down. Marla took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs. She had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild her life, to find her way forward. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how to carry it. And for the first time, she felt that burden ease, if only for a moment. As the soft breeze whispered through the trees, she began walking, leaving the well behind her. She wasn't running from it, she was simply moving on. When she opened her eyes again, the world was different. The sunlight poured down through the trees, and the air was full of birdsong. She was back in her own world, the one she had left behind when she made her fateful wish. Her house stood just ahead, familiar and warm in the soft glow of the morning light. The same place where she had once held Tommy in her arms, the same place where he had taken his last breath. But now, it didn't feel like a prison. Marla walked toward the house, her heart still heavy, but filled with the kind of quiet peace that only comes after the storm. As she stepped inside, she saw his things scattered around, Tommy's toys, his clothes, the little drawings he used to make. They weren't gone. They were still here, still hers, still reminders of the love she had for her son. But now, they weren't weights around her neck. They were memories, and for the first time in a long while, they didn't hurt. Marla walked to the bedroom, where Tommy's bed once stood, and in its place, she saw the warmth of the room as she had left it, peaceful and undisturbed. She had been so consumed by her grief, by her need to fix things, that she had forgotten what it meant to live, to move forward. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, an incoming message. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she read the words. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you are not alone in this. Remember to take care of yourself, too." Marla smiled softly, tears welling in her eyes once more. It was a message from an old friend, someone who had stood by her even when she had pushed everyone away. It was a simple message, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone, that even in the darkest of times, there was light to be found. She wiped away a tear, feeling the weight of the last few weeks begin to lift from her shoulders, piece by piece. Tommy's memory would always be with her, but now it was a memory she could cherish. And as the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm, golden light through the windows, Marla closed her eyes and whispered a prayer for her son. It was a prayer of peace, a prayer of letting go, a prayer of acceptance. For she had learned that no wish, no matter how desperate, could ever change the past. But forgiveness and the courage to move forward could change everything. The well was silent now, and so was Marla. She had found peace. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.